Hello friends, welcome back to Cloud Pedagogy. Today our topic is the ways how we can interact with AWS. When you own the infrastructure, it's easy to understand how you interact with it because you can see it, touch it, and work with it on every level. If I have a server that I have stood up in my closet, interacting with that server is easy because it's mine. I can feel it and touch it. When I remove the ability for me to touch and see something, when the infrastructure becomes virtual, the way that I work with that infrastructure has to change a bit. Instead of physically managing my infrastructure, I now logically manage it through the AWS Application Programming Interface, or we call API. Every action you make in AWS is an API call that is authenticated and authorized. In AWS, you can make API calls to services and resources in three ways. 1. AWS Management Console. Next, AWS Command Line Interface or CLI. The last one, the AWS Software Development Kits, or we can say SDKs. First, we'll go through the AWS Management Console. When people are first getting started with AWS, they will typically use the AWS Management Console. This is a web-based console that you log into from your browser. The great thing about the console is that you can point and click. By simply clicking and following prompts, you can get started with some of the services without knowing anything about the service. With the console, there is no need to worry about scripting or finding the proper syntax. When you log into the console, the landing page will show you all of the possible services that you can work with, organizing them into relevant categories such as compute, databases, storage, and more. On the upper right corner is the region selector where you want to work in. If you click it and change the region, you will make requests to the services in those regions. The URL changes too. Changing the region directs the browser to make requests to a whole different AWS region, which is represented by a different subdomain. I mean, if I change the region to Paris, you are making requests to eu-west3.console.aws.amazon.com or the Paris region's web console. The next one is AWS Command Line Interface. After you work with the console for a while, you may want to move away from the manual creation of resources. For example, in the console, you have to go through multiple screens to set configurations to create a virtual machine. I would need to go through that process all over again. Well, this is helpful. It also leaves room for human error. I might miss a checkbox or misspell something or even skip important settings by accident. So when you get more familiar with AWS, or if you are working in a production environment that requires a degree of risk management, you should move to a tool that enables you to script or program these API calls. One of these tools is called the AWS Command Line Interface or CLI. The AWS CLI is a unified tool to manage AWS services. With just one tool to download and configure, you control multiple AWS services from the command line and automate them with scripts. The AWS CLI is open source and there are installers available for Windows, Linux and Mac OS. Consider a scenario where you run tens of servers on AWS for your application's frontend. You want to run a report to collect data from all of these servers. You need to do this programmatically every day because the server details may change. Instead of manually logging into the AWS Management Console and copying, pasting information, you can schedule an AWS Command Line Interface script with an API call to pull this data for you. Here is an example of running an API call against a service using the AWS CLI. AWS EC2 describe instances. It will show you the list of EC2 instances with little details. Next thing, AWS Software Development Kits. One command versus multiple screens you have to click through in the console. And it can help reduce accidental human errors, but that also means you have to work with defined syntax and get that syntax correct in order for your command to run successfully. So there is some upfront cost in just understanding how to form commands, but after a while you can begin to script these commands out, making them repeatable, which will save you time in the long run. This is the other tool that allows you to interact with the AWS API programmatically, is nothing but AWS Software Development Kits or SDKs. API calls to AWS can also be performed by executing code with programming languages. You can do this by using AWS Software Development Kits (SDKs). SDKs are open source and maintained by AWS for the most popular programming languages such as C++, Go, Java, JavaScript, .NET, Node.js, PHP, Python, and Ruby. Developers commonly use AWS SDKs to integrate their application source code with AWS services. Let's say you want to run a report to collect data from all of those servers at one execution. This action can be achieved from within the source code by using the AWS SDK for Python. Here is an example of code you can implement to work with AWS resources using the Python AWS SDK. For example, our student directory application runs using Python and Flask. If I want to store all the student photos in an AWS storage service, I could use the Python SDK to write code to interact with the AWS storage service. The ability of managing AWS services from a place where you can run source code with the conditions, loops, arrays, lists, and other programming elements provides a lot of power and creativity. Alright, that wraps up this session. To recap, you have three main options to connect with AWS: the console, the CLI, and the SDKs. In our course, we'll mainly be using the console to interact with the AWS services. Well, I think that is all that I have to say for this session, but I hope to be back soon. Until then, see you.